11:42 p.m. The vibration of the phone sliced through the night like a sudden streak of light, turning the quiet stillness inside the Zurich hotel room into something sharp and tense. Ethan Cole opened his eyes immediately. He wasn't the kind of man who woke easily, and his life had never allowed randomness to force its way in. But there was something about that vibration, slow, steady, persistent, that told him this was not a call he could ignore. The screen displayed an unknown number from New York. Ethan stared at it for a few seconds. He let the first call go unanswered, but the second call came instantly, as if the person on the other end knew he was hesitating. He answered. On the line was silence, long, stretched, fragile. Then a very small voice came through, shaky, hoarse, worn out from crying too long. Are you Ethan Cole?" It was a child's voice. Ethan sat up, his tone dropping into that familiar, controlled depth. "Yes, I'm listening. Who is this?" Another pause. Tight, breathless, as if the child was searching for the exact words to say something that shouldn't have to be said. "My name is Grace." The girl's voice sounded like it was breaking. I think I'm your daughter. My mom is Lily Parker. She's in the ICU. The doctors said a family member has to sign the papers for her treatment. I didn't know who else to call except you." The world around Ethan stopped. Ethan Cole was a man who had spent his entire life controlling variables. He ran one of the fastest-growing biotech corporations in the country. His schedule was arranged in blocks that locked together like the beams of a steel bridge. His personal life was sealed shut like the classified archive floor beneath his company headquarters. No one knew what he really thought, what he feared, or what he felt. And it had been a long time since he had let anyone get close. Except Lily. But that was years ago. They had met in a fleeting, ordinary moment. In the lobby of the office building, her hot latte spilled onto his white shirt. Ethan's reaction had been irritation, sharp, automatic. But Lily just laughed softly, her eyes warm, and said something that made his entire world tilt for a heartbeat. "Sorry about that, but honestly, coffee suits you." There was something in her gaze, like late summer sunlight, not blinding, but warm enough for someone to lean into. They never defined what they were. Lily never forced him to name anything. She was just there, in late dinners, quiet laughter, and those small, gentle touches that softened his mind slowly, steadily. Until the day she said, "Ethan, I'm pregnant." He did not respond with his heart. He used logic, cold, precise, razor-edged. Every word he said then, simple as they were, was sharp enough to break something that could never be repaired. "I'm not ready. This might be a mistake, and we don't even know for sure if the baby is mine." Lily didn't cry. She just looked at him for a long time. Then she walked away, quietly, decisively. Back then, Ethan believed he had done the rational thing to keep his life on track. He didn't call. He didn't ask. He didn't look for her. And he told himself time would erase everything. But Grace's voice now shattered every wall he had ever built. Ethan stood up abruptly. "Grace, what hospital are you at?" "St. Luke's in Manhattan. Mom already went into surgery. The doctor said I'm too young to sign for treatment. They said we have to call family." The girl drew a trembling breath. "I remembered Mom saying your name once, so I called." No sobbing, no drama. Just the steady courage of a child who has learned to grow up quietly. Ethan said nothing else. He booked the emergency flight within 2 minutes, grabbed his coat and passport, and left the hotel without looking back. He had no plan, no backup, no risk assessment. For the first time in his life, he was running toward only one thing. If Lily didn't make it, and if Grace truly was his child, he would never be able to forgive himself. The flight from Zurich to New York was 5 hours, but for Ethan, it stretched like a lifetime. He sat in first class, wide leather seats, warm, dim lighting, but everything felt hollow. The plane window reflected his face back at him, tense, rigid, and for the first time in years, afraid. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Grace's voice. I just couldn't think of anyone else to call. When Ethan stepped into St. Luke's Hospital at 2 a.m., Manhattan outside was still drenched in that amber glow, reflecting off the wet pavement. The emergency wing was brightly lit and cold. Ethan presented his ID and checked in. Immediately, a hospital social worker was called, because Grace was a minor with no adult accompanying her. The woman spoke in a tone gentle but precise. We need an adult who can temporarily take responsibility for medical decisions on Grace's behalf. This is the temporary authorization form. You may sign it if you believe you have the right to do so. There were thousands of ways to refuse, hundreds of reasons to stay safe. But Ethan simply said, I'll sign. His name appeared on the bold line, Guardian Temporarily Responsible. In that very moment, something in him shifted. The pediatric waiting room was deep in the hallway. The cold, white neon lights washed over pale green vinyl chairs. Grace sat there, so small she looked like she might dissolve into the color of the hospital walls. Her hair was braided to one side, hoodie a bit too big, eyes swollen from crying and staying awake. Yet her gaze remained oddly steady. When she saw Ethan, she stood. She did not run to him. She did not burst into tears. She simply faced him. Her eyes, a pale gray blue, were heartbreakingly familiar. You're Ethan Cole, she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan kneeled so their eyes were level. Yes, and I... Grace shook her head. Just a small, quiet movement. Her voice was soft but clear. You don't need to call yourself my dad, not if you're not ready. I understand. No accusation, no resentment. Just the early wisdom of a child who has learned to hold herself upright in her own loneliness. Ethan felt something tighten across his chest. Your name is Grace, right? Grace nodded. Mom said you were very busy. It wasn't your fault. She looked down at her shoes. She never said you were a bad person, a simple sentence, but enough to make his heart fall into a place he didn't know existed. Ethan drew a slow breath. I want to be here, if you'll let me. Grace studied him for a long moment, as if measuring whether this presence would stay or fade. Finally, she lifted her hand. A tiny hand, warm, slightly trembling. Ethan took it, and in that moment he understood his life had just changed course. They entered the ICU. The room was dim, quiet, like time had paused within it. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor continued, unhurried, unchanging. Lily lay there. Her face was pale from sedation. The slender bridge of her nose was exactly as he remembered. Her lips were dry and colorless. IV lines, ventilator tubes, gauze, all surrounding a body that had fought too hard, too long, alone. Ethan stepped closer, one slow step at a time. He did not offer an explanation. He did not lift a hand to hide the wetness in his eyes. He simply placed his hand over hers gently, as though touching too firmly might disturb old pain. His voice was tight when he spoke. I'm here. Grace stood beside him, placing her small hand over her mother's. She didn't cry, she simply stood, waiting, just as she had done for years. And in that silence, no one used the word family. But in that exact moment, a door quietly opened for it to become real. Morning arrived slowly in the ICU, as though even the sunlight had to soften itself before entering a place this fragile. A pale orange dawn filtered through the large window, spreading gently across the walls. Ethan was still sitting beside Lily's bed, in the exact position he had been in since he placed his hand over hers the night before. His shoulders leaned slightly forward, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, the tendons along his wrist drawn tight from not daring to let go. He was not a man accustomed to waiting. His life ran on momentum, precision, speed. But in this room, he had no power to command anything. He could only stay. Grace slept on a small chair near the window, curled inside the blanket a nurse had brought just before dawn. A stuffed rabbit lay tucked beneath her chin, like a loyal companion that had never left her. Around 7 a.m., a night shift nurse walked in quietly. She checked Lily's vitals, changed an IV bag, then glanced at Ethan with a look that was both clinical and gently human, the kind of compassion that ICU rooms rarely had to spare. "She's stabilizing, little by little," the nurse said softly, as though sound itself might disturb the silence. "We've managed the internal bleeding. Her lungs need time to recover. Right now, she's under light sedation so her body doesn't have to work too hard." Ethan tried to nod, but he couldn't pull his eyes away from Lily's hand beneath his. The nurse scribbled a few notes on the chart at the foot of the bed, then left, and the room settled again into something like a long, careful breath. Grace woke without a sound. She slid off the chair, pulled her small canvas shoes on, and stepped to Ethan's side. She didn't ask, "Will Mom wake up?" She didn't ask, "Are we going home?" At Grace's age, waiting didn't happen through words. It happened through quiet eyes, a stuffed rabbit held close and staying exactly where she needed to be. Ethan looked down at her. "Would you like some breakfast?" His voice softened, not because he forced it, but because something tightly wound in him was slowly loosening. Grace shook her head. "I want to stay near Mom." Ethan glanced through the window to the hallway, where the morning shift was beginning and the lobby was growing busier. He understood then what he needed to do. Not just for Lily, but for this child, the child who had learned never to ask for anything. "I'll go get something," he said. "Would you like warm milk?" Grace thought for a moment, then nodded, just once, very small. Not because she wanted it, but because she was beginning to believe he would come back. The weight of that belief was quiet, but heavy. The hospital cafeteria in the early morning always held a smell that was impossible to name. Fresh coffee, toasted bread, and the faint trace of disinfectant still lingering from the night. Ethan stood in line, fingers resting lightly on the plastic tray. He couldn't remember the last time he stood in a line like this. His life had been full of private elevators, private cars, private rooms, everything insulated behind invisible glass. But this morning, he was just a man afraid of losing someone. He returned with 2 cups of warm milk and a buttered roll. Grace sat on the bench outside the ICU hallway, feet dangling, eyes fixed on the ICU door as if, by looking long enough, her mother might simply step out. Ethan sat beside her, saying nothing at first. He offered the milk. Grace took it with both hands. "Mom likes cinnamon," she whispered, like she was sharing something delicate and precious. "She sprinkles a little on warm milk. When she's sick, she says cinnamon feels like someone is there, even when no one is." Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. Not breaking, opening. "We'll get cinnamon this afternoon," he said. "When she gets better, she'll smell it." Grace nodded. This wasn't loud, triumphant hope. This was a quiet, steady hope, the kind carried by people who have already known loss. By late afternoon, the ICU attending physician stepped into the room, holding a tablet of medical charts and documents. He carried the demeanor of someone well accustomed to delivering bad news, yet careful enough to recognize the rare moment when the news was good. "She's responding well to treatment," he reported. "If everything continues to stabilize, tonight we'll begin reducing the sedation to see how her body responds on its own. I can't promise anything yet, but this is a positive sign." Grace tightened her grip on Ethan's hand, not out of fear, but out of sudden, overwhelming relief. Ethan nodded. "How long until she can wake?" "Could be a few hours, could be longer. The brain needs time to find its rhythm again." The doctor paused, his gaze settling on Ethan. "She'll need close support when she wakes, not just physically, emotionally too." Ethan understood, and he didn't avoid it anymore. "I'll stay." The words weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, but their weight was deep enough that Grace turned to him, as if she had just heard a promise she had waited a very long time for. That night, when the ICU lights dimmed to a softer glow and the monitors clicked in steady, unhurried beats, Ethan remained in his chair. Grace slept on the small seat nearby. No one moved from their place. And then, slowly, Lily's finger stirred. A movement so small it could have been missed if one wasn't looking closely enough. Ethan stopped breathing. "Lily?" His voice sounded like it had been held under stone for years. Her eyelids flickered, opening bit by bit, as if she were swimming upward from deep water. White light, heavy breath, the world returning one heartbeat at a time. Lily saw the ceiling first, then, slowly, she turned her head and saw Ethan. There was no dramatic calling of names, no sudden embrace, no flood of tears like in the stories people tell themselves will happen. She simply spoke, her voice so faint it was almost only air. "Where's Grace?" Ethan's eyes followed to the chair by the door. "She's right here, she's okay." A long exhale slipped from Lily's lips, not like a sigh, but like a breath her body had been holding for days. Silence lingered before she looked back at Ethan, eyes no longer clouded by medication, but clear with sharp, aching awareness. "Don't think that just because I'm lying here, things between us get to start over." It wasn't gentle, it wasn't forgiving, it was the truth. Ethan nodded, and his words landed slowly, deliberately, like they were being set down, not spoken. "I know." Lily stared at him a long time, as though trying to see whether his words were real or simply guilt taking shape in the form of convenience. "Did you come because of me?" she asked, "or because of Grace?" Ethan didn't look away. For the first time in years, he didn't choose the answer that would make him seem better. "I came for both of you. But if I have to name the reason that brought me here first, I came because of Grace." Lily didn't nod. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything at all, but she didn't let go of his hand. And sometimes in life, not letting go is the gentlest form of recognition there is. Lily was moved to the recovery ward on the third day, once her breathing had stabilized and sedation had been reduced. The new room no longer carried the endless cold light of the ICU. It was warmer, with cream-colored curtains and small potted plants placed deliberately to soften the sterility. Even so, the air remained thin and still, as if every movement had to slow down to avoid disturbing something delicate, mending from within. Grace sat close beside her mother, leaning lightly against her shoulder. She didn't ask whether it hurt. She didn't ask when they would go home. Perhaps, in a way, only children who have witnessed the fragility of adults can understand. She knew that silence was sometimes the kindest answer. Ethan stood by the window, hand resting on the sill, looking out over the small hospital garden where a few winter elms still clung to their leaves. He didn't keep his distance out of fear of being rejected. but because he understood that his presence now needed to be quiet, patient, steady, not something that crashed in like a late apology. A nurse guided Lily through slow breathing exercises. "Each breath is a step," she said, gentle but firm. "Not strong, just steady." Lily followed. Her body was so weak that lifting her hand a few centimeters caused her face to tighten. But there was no complaint. Ethan watched, and it felt like something invisible tightened around his chest. He had once called her fragile. He had once called her too emotional. He had once believed she didn't understand his world. But now, watching her fight for each breath, he saw clearly. She had always been stronger than him, just strong in a way that made no noise. That afternoon, a hospital social worker came to meet with Ethan and Lily about the post-discharge care plan. She spread the documents across the table like a map of a new life. Medications, breathing exercises, follow-up appointments, and most importantly, the need for 24/7 support for at least the first 4 weeks. "The body will recover," she said calmly, "but the psychological recovery after trauma is just as important. The caregiver needs patience, and the stability of the environment will play a major role." Lily pressed her lips together. She was used to handling things alone, finding work on her own, raising her child on her own, surviving alone. The idea of depending on someone again felt like a door being opened and feared at the same time. Grace looked from her mother to Ethan, then back to her mother. Not urging, just waiting to see whether this time the adults would keep their own promises. Ethan placed his hand on the table, steady, without hesitation. "I'll take care of the caregiving," he said, voice low and firm, like a commitment carved in stone. "I'll rearrange my work so I can be here full time." Lily turned to him. Her eyes no longer held anger, but they did not hold forgiveness either. They were the eyes of someone who had once been left, trying to understand whether this time could be real. "Ethan," she said softly, but slowly, as if placing each word down like a brick. "You can't show up only when there's a crisis. You can't stay because of guilt. Grace grew up without you. If you step into her life again and leave again, the wound will be bigger than the first one." Grace didn't blink, but her small body tightened just slightly. Children hear everything, even when they don't speak. Ethan drew a long breath. "I know," he replied. "And I know that if I say I've changed, that means nothing. I won't ask you to believe me right away. I'll let you see. Every day. No flourish. No dramatic speech. Just truth." Lily didn't answer immediately, but she didn't say no. And sometimes, in a life that has been closed off for a long time, not closing the door is already a very large acceptance. 2 days later, Lily was discharged. New York was covered in a light rain, the kind that turns footsteps on the sidewalk into soft, melancholy sound. The hospital transport car took the 3 of them to Lily's small apartment, where everything was arranged neatly in the way of someone who has learned to live with limited space and limited time. A small living room, a gray fabric sofa worn down at one corner, a tiny cactus near the window, and a wall covered in Grace's drawings, suns, houses, cats, and stick figures holding hands, taped up with strips of multicolored tape. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking at the apartment like he was looking into a life he should have been part of all along. Grace removed her mother's coat and hung it carefully. The motion was so practiced that even an adult could not help but watch in silence. No one taught her. She learned because she had to. Ethan helped Lily sit down on the sofa. "Do you want warm water or ginger tea?" he asked. Lily looked up, slightly surprised. "Ginger tea." He nodded and went to the kitchen without looking around for where anything was. as if he had lived here for a long time. Grace watched him go, then sat beside Lily, resting her head gently on her mother's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Lily whispered. Grace nodded. "I'm okay, because you're home." The answer made Lily close her eyes for a moment, as if holding her tears in place required real strength. Their first dinner together felt strange, but gentle. Ethan tried to make chicken soup, a dish he only knew from an 8-minute cooking video that he watched 3 times in a row. The soup was a little bland, the bread a little burnt, the carrots cut a bit too thick, but Grace ate every spoonful, holding the bowl as if cradling something soft inside her chest. Lily didn't compliment, and she didn't criticize. She simply watched, and there was something very different in that watching. Midway through the meal, Ethan said, "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. I know you and Grace learned how to live without me. I won't try to step into a place that isn't open yet. I just want to be here every day." Lily set her spoon down, fingers trembling slightly from the ache still lingering in her chest. "Being here isn't the hard part," she said slowly. "The hard part is staying." Ethan nodded. "I'll stay." Lily looked directly into his eyes, not to test him, not to check whether he was lying, but to see whether he was clear. Grace glanced between the 2 adults, then suddenly delivered a verdict. Simple, honest, in a way no adult could ever imitate. "Dad can eat dinner with me every day, that's enough." Lily turned to her child. Ethan looked at Grace, and something in his chest tightened. There was no miracle in that room, no dramatic reunion, no sweeping emotional crescendo, just a very small invitation. And a man who, for the first time in his life, knew how to treasure something small more than all he had ever built. Night fell. Grace was asleep, Rabbit tucked beside her. The apartment was quiet, with only the sound of rain outside the balcony. Lily leaned back against the wall, one hand resting on her aching ribs. Ethan stood a few steps away, not approaching, but not retreating either. "I used to think," Lily said softly, "that being alone was the safest thing. Because if no one touches you, then no one can leave you." Ethan felt the words land in him like a slow, deep hand pressed against his chest. "But," Lily continued, "being alone isn't peace. It's just the habit of loneliness." She lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time since the ICU, there were no bars in her gaze. "I'm learning how to let someone be here again. But that person has to stay, not for a day, not for a week, but every day." Ethan nodded. He didn't rush forward. He didn't make bigger promises. He didn't ask for forgiveness. "I'll stay, one day at a time." No dramatic vow, no cinematic pause, just a sentence that touched the ground, steady and real. Lily released a slow breath, the kind held too long inside the chest. She didn't reach out. He didn't step closer, but the space between them, for the first time, was no longer a wall. Sometimes love doesn't return with a call or an embrace. Sometimes it returns in 2 people standing close without fear. Time didn't move by the ticking of a clock, but by very small shifts in that small home. On the first morning, Ethan took Grace to school. The scene was nothing like the golden, charming movie moments people imagine. There was no glowing sunlight, no cheerful music, just the kitchen carrying the warm smell of pancake batter and a man trying his best to do something he had never imagined himself doing. Ethan stood at the stove, pan in one hand, spatula in the other, trying to flip pancakes without burning them. The first batch burned. The second was raw. The third, slightly misshapen, but at least evenly golden. Grace sat at the table, hair messy, hugging her rabbit, half asleep. watching him with the calm of a child who has already seen all kinds of chaotic mornings. "We can have cereal," she said softly, offering a solution, not a judgment. Ethan blinked, then smiled, a small, real smile, unforced. "Okay, but pancakes will return." He said it not because the pancakes were good, but because he didn't intend to give up. Grace shrugged, but the corner of her mouth tugged upward, just a little. That was a small victory, and small victories are what build a family. On the way to school, Ethan walked at the same slow pace as Grace's small steps. The city in the morning still held a trace of mist, the trees along the sidewalk still wet. Adults walked quickly, rushed, busy, but the two of them weren't running from anything anymore, so they walked unhurried. "What's your favorite subject?" Ethan asked, gently, not to fill silence, but to open a small door. "Music," Grace answered. "Why music?" Grace thought for a moment, then spoke with the kind of honesty that has no sugarcoating. "Because in music, people don't have to say a lot, but they still understand each other." Ethan paused mid-step. He understood better than anyone what it felt like to live in a world where words are never enough to say what's inside. He knelt, retying Grace's shoelace that had come undone when she got out of the car. "I understand," he murmured. Grace looked at him, surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to answer in a way that matched the rhythm of her heart so precisely. At the school gate, a morning shift teacher observed them. Grace turned back, without hesitation, without pause. "This is my dad." The sentence landed like a clean, round musical note. Not loud, not dramatic, but true, in a way that no one could deny. And sometimes when something is finally called by its right name, it finds its place in the world on its own. In the weeks that followed, Lily's home was no longer a home of two, but a home of three. No one declared it. But there were small signs. Ethan knew exactly where Lily kept the ginger tea. Grace could tell Ethan's footsteps in the hallway, slower when he worried, steadier when he was content. Lily no longer startled at the sound of the door opening. In the afternoons, Ethan worked online in the corner of the living room, while Grace sat on the floor drawing, her pencil looping and wandering. Lily lay curled on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, sometimes glancing over at the other two as if watching a scene she wasn't sure she deserved to have. No one said the word family, but everything in that room was quietly saying it. Then, one evening, when the hospital called to inform them that Lily's accident had not been an accident at all, but an intentional forced collision, the air in the apartment changed. No one cried. No one slammed a table. There was just a deep, sinking silence. Ethan didn't ask who would do this. He only asked Lily, "Do you want to face this alone?" Lily looked at him for a long time. "No." A word so soft it could have been breath, but for someone who had lived by self-reliance, saying no was a door swinging wide open. Ethan worked with the police, with lawyers, with Lily's former landlord, not using power to crush, not using money to overpower, but using the law, patience, and transparency. Not to prove that he was strong, but to prove he would not leave them again. After 2 weeks of statements, evidence, and legal procedures, the matter finally came to an end. The people who once lingered in the shadows, watching Lily, were forced to step back. Contact was cut. Distance was enforced. No more footsteps echoing down the hallway at night. No more sense of eyes following her from behind. Lily didn't say anything when the news came. She simply stood still for a long time, one hand resting lightly over her heart, feeling her heartbeat slow, gradually, to something quiet and steady. The next morning, when she stepped outside, the wind passed through her hair like a long exhale of spring. And for the first time in months, She didn't have to turn around, just that. But sometimes peace returns exactly that quietly. Yet the deeper change wasn't outside, it was inside. Lily had seen that Ethan hadn't returned because of guilt. He had returned to build. One late afternoon at the end of April, the light at the window was soft like honey, and the breeze carried the faint scent of pollen. Ethan called Grace into the kitchen. "I need your help with something important," he said, serious enough that Grace thought something big had happened. "Help wash dishes?" Grace asked, hands on her hips. Very small hands, but very official. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "Much bigger than washing dishes." Grace tilted her head. "But Mom is sleeping. We shouldn't wake her." Ethan sat down beside her, his voice softening. "Right. This is bigger than waking her." He lowered his voice. "I want to ask your mom if she would like us to become a real family. And I want you to help me get ready." Grace didn't answer right away. She just looked at Ethan for a long, long moment. Then she hugged him, slow, tight, no words needed. "I've been waiting for this day for so long." They didn't prepare anything elaborate. Grace drew a card, 3 people holding hands under a sky full of stars. Ethan baked an apple pie, not burnt, not too sweet, not perfect, just made with hands and with heart. When Lily stepped into the kitchen, both of them were waiting. Ethan didn't kneel. He didn't hold out a diamond ring. He simply spoke, with a steady voice, the voice of someone who has finally found the right direction. "I won't promise to be perfect. I will make mistakes. There will be times I don't know what to do, but I promise I will be here, every day, not out of obligation but because I love you, and because I love Grace. If you agree, let's call ourselves a family." Grace placed her hand on her mother's, the smallest but strongest anchor. "I want that too." Tears finally slipped down Lily's cheeks, not bursting, not choking. Just the quiet tears of a long winter finally melting. "I agree." 2 months later, their wedding took place in the garden behind a small suburban church, where golden string lights hung between 2 birch trees and wooden chairs were wiped clean by kind neighbors. There were no extravagant gowns, no grand arrangements. Just Lily in a simple white dress, her hair adorned with a wildflower Grace had picked from the nearby field. Grace was the flower girl. Her shoes were a little too big. She stumbled a bit when she walked. She smiled like the sun. Ethan stood waiting at the end of the aisle. There was no lavish ceremony, no master of ceremony, just the soft wind and the sound of hearts finding each other again. When they took each other's hands, they didn't speak long vows. They simply said, 3 people, 1 home. And that was enough. At the end of the day, when the sky shifted to a tender shade of orange, Ethan lifted Grace and spun her gently. Her laughter rang like light glass bells. Lily stepped closer and linked her arm through his. No rush, no effort, just closeness finding its rightful place. The 3 of them walked toward the small house where the windows glowed warm with evening light, where the smell of apple pie still lingered in the kitchen, where a pair of tiny shoes lay crooked beside the rug. A place where they no longer had to wonder whether they belonged to one another. They didn't speak on the walk home. But the silence was not empty, it was full. Full with matched breaths, full with steps taken together, full with something lost for a long time, now returned. Because some kinds of happiness do not arrive like fireworks. They come like a small lamp being lit every evening, a hand that does not let go, a door that does not close too soon. And this time, when life tested them, no one let go first. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments. We really do listen. Share this with someone who loves a good story. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next soul-stirring journey.
Attention! This is not a fairy tale about a princess. This is the brutal reality of a queen whom everyone considered a pawn. Alexander Sterling, an absolute king in the concrete jungle of Manhattan, saw his wife, Victoria, as little more than a beautiful piece of decor. On the most crucial night of his career, the annual Metropolitan Legacy Gala, Alexander stood before his rivals, partners, and the press, and publicly humiliated her. He called her small, amateurish. What he ignored, as he laughed heartily, was that Victoria was about to take the throne. Because in the world of old money and new power, the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. Sterling Heights on 5th Avenue 740 wasn't a home. It was a declaration. A fortress of beige Italian marble and glass walls that severely judged Central Park, adorned with art bought for investment value, not beauty. This was Alexander Sterling's world, and Victoria Sterling simply lived in it. Alexander was a man sculpted from granite and ambition. He was the CEO of Sterling Holdings, a real estate empire that had devoured half of the Manhattan skyline. He hadn't inherited it. He had weaponized it. Tall, with a distinguished mane of silver hair, he wore bespoke Brioni suits that seemed to repel both dust and weakness. His voice was a low murmur, and he expected, and always received, absolute obedience. And then there was Victoria. To Alexander, Victoria was his greatest acquisition. She was a Kensington. The Kensingtons were old-line aristocracy, the kind of money that whispered in the salons of the Upper East Side and owned dusty libraries in estates upstate. They possessed the one thing Alexander couldn't build, a legacy. He had married her a decade ago, merging his brute force wealth with her silent pedigree. In his eyes, the deal was simple. He gave her a life of unlimited luxury. In return, she was to be beautiful, silent, and supportive. Victoria was pale and slender, with large, observant gray eyes that most mistook for shyness. She ran the house with the silent efficiency of a Swiss timepiece. She organized his dinners, filtered his invitations, and wore the precise, elegant clothes he preferred. The blue one, not that. The one with the finer weave, he grunted, snatching a silk tie from her hands in their vast, mahogany-paneled dressing room. Arthur Kensington's speech is all that matters. He's finally retiring from the Metropolitan Legacy Fund. Tonight, they announced the new chair. The Metropolitan Legacy Fund was the unspoken god of New York philanthropy. It was a century-old institution that held the keys to the city's cultural and social future. Its approval could greenlight a new museum wing, a billion-dollar urban renewal project, or kill it entirely. The MLF chair was, in many circles, more powerful than the mayor. "Are you still sure it will be you?" Victoria asked. Her hands intertwined. Alexander finally looked at her, a smirk of smugness on his thin lips. "Victoria, it's done. My Sterling Resurgence project for the financial district is exactly the kind of bold move the MLF needs. Kensington knows I have the vision to lead the fund. The only other remotely serious contender is that tech bro, Julian Vance. And the MLF board would never give the keys to a new money disruptor from the West Coast who wears hoodies to board meetings." He straightened his tie. "This is the final piece. Once I'm chair, the Resurgence project is unstoppable. Our name will be on every building, from Wall Street to Midtown." Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course, dear. It will be your night." "Our night, Victoria. Our night," he corrected, though his tone made it clear he meant his. "Now, make sure you wear the diamonds, the ones I bought you at Cartier after the Marbella deal. They reflect well under the lights." He strode out of the room, leaving her in his wake. Victoria stood silently for a moment, the scent of his expensive cologne hanging in the air. She looked at the two rejected ties, then returned to her own wing of the penthouse. Her room was different. It was smaller, filled with books, and contained a small, antique Kensington desk. She sat down, her posture unwavering, and opened a laptop. It wasn't the sleek, modern tablet Alexander had bought her. This one was older, encrypted, and password protected. She logged in. The screen wasn't filled with party plans or fashion sites. It was a complex dashboard of financial portfolios, legal documents, and encrypted message threads. For the past decade, Victoria had been the sole trustee of what remained of her family's legacy, the Kensington Trust. When her father died, the trust was nearly insolvent, bled dry by bad investments. Alexander had glanced at their books, dismissed it as petty cash, and told her to let his accountants handle the charitable deductions. He never looked again. He never knew that Victoria, the quiet wife he mistook for a doll, had inherited her grandfather's mind, a mind for numbers and strategy. While Alexander built glass towers, Victoria quietly and meticulously rebuilt a stone foundation. She had spent a decade engaged in the hobby Alexander so despised. She had attended small, unglamorous committees for libraries in Brooklyn and art programs in Harlem. But she wasn't just planning floral arrangements. She was learning. She was networking. She was identifying cracks in the city's philanthropic armor. She made small, brilliant, anonymous investments. She learned the true language of power, not the loud roars of men like Alexander, but the silent, binding signature on a contract. The Kensington Trust, once a relic, was now a silent powerhouse. Its assets had grown by 2,000%, and no one, least of all her husband, had the slightest idea. She opened a secure email from the MLF's legal counsel. It was a simple confirmation. Subject: Agenda: Item 4. All terms accepted. The transition is closed. Victoria closed the laptop. She went to her closet and looked past the beige, cream, and gray dresses Alexander preferred. In the back, hidden in a simple black suit bag, was another gown, a custom-made Oscar de la Renta in a deep, possessive shade of emerald green. She looked at her watch. 6:00 p.m. Time to put on the diamonds and play the role of Victoria Sterling one last time. The main hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed. It wasn't just a party. It was a demonstration of hierarchy. Towering floral arrangements rose toward the vaulted ceilings. Champagne flowed from ice-carved fountains, and the air vibrated with the sound of 1,000 powerful, concise conversations. This was the Metropolitan Legacy Fund Gala, the alpha predator of New York charity events. Alexander Sterling moved through the crowd like a shark. Victoria was on his arm, a silent, perfect accessory, in a shimmering pale gold gown and the obligatory Cartier diamonds. Her smile was polite, her gaze distant. Alexander was in his element. "Senator," he boomed, grabbing a politician's shoulder. "My Resurgence project will create 10,000 jobs in your district. 10,000. Alexander, always a pleasure," the senator replied, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more important. "Alexander!" A sharp voice cut through the murmur. Amelia Jones, the most feared social and financial columnist in the country, approached them, her pen ready like a scalpel. "Big night for you. The whispers are deafening. Everyone says you're the heir apparent." Alexander gave her his most charming, predatory smile. "Amelia, you know I'm only here to support the fund. We all want what's best for this city." "Of course," she said, her own smile equally sharp. "But your Resurgence project is controversial. Many in the preservation community call it a vanity project that will destroy the character of the historic downtown." Alexander's smile tightened. "That's small-minded talk, Amelia. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Progress requires bold strokes. The MLF knows that." "We shall see," she said, before her eyes landed on Victoria. "And Mrs. Sterling, a pleasure as always. You're radiant. What is your role in this resurgence?" Before Victoria could open her mouth, Alexander let out a loud, dismissive laugh. "Victoria keeps the home running, don't you, darling? She makes sure my suits are pressed and the champagne is cold. It's a full-time job, believe me." Amelia's eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch. Victoria's polite smile did not falter, though her grip on her tiny clutch tightened. "I mean, she has her own little projects, of course," Alexander continued, gesturing vaguely. "The Kensington Trust. Very noble. She's on committees. They debate floral arrangements for library fundraisers. It's wonderful. Keeps her busy." He was enjoying this performance. He was positioning himself as the serious man of action, and his wife as the charming, frivolous socialite. This was the image. Across the room, a different kind of power entered. Julian Vance. He was 35, a decade younger than Alexander, and had amassed a dozen fortunes in Silicon Valley. Now he was back in his native New York, investing billions in disruptive technology and, to Alexander's disgust, in philanthropy. He wore a dark Tom Ford suit, impeccably tailored, but no tie. "Alexander," Vance said, his voice soft and clear. He nodded politely. "Victoria, you look stunning." There was an immediate, subtle shift in his tone. When he spoke to Alexander, it was a challenge. When he spoke to Victoria, it was with genuine, almost curious respect. "Vance," Alexander responded, his voice dripping with condescension. "Surprised to see you here. I thought your people were more digital." "The MLF is the heart of New York, Alexander. I'm a New Yorker," Vance said simply. "I just hope the fund's new leadership has a vision for the next century, not the last. This was a direct hit at Alexander's project, which was pure brick-and-mortar arrogance. Vision, Alexander scoffed. Vision isn't about apps and algorithms, son. It's about steel. It's about concrete. It's about building something permanent. Permanent can be synonymous with obsolete, Alexander, Vance countered. The future isn't about building over the city. It's about building in it, connecting communities, digital, green, sustainable infrastructure. Vance's gaze drifted from Alexander to Victoria, who had been watching the exchange with the quiet intensity of a chess master. "And you, Victoria?" Vance asked, ignoring her husband. "What do you think the future of the city is? Steel or connection?" Alexander tensed, ready to interrupt, but Victoria spoke first. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension. "I believe the future, Mr. Vance," she said, meeting his eyes, "is realizing that the strongest structures are built on legacy. The question is simply what kind of legacy one chooses to build." Vance stared at her for a long instant. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well said, Mrs. Sterling. Very well said." Alexander, however, was furious. He hated being upstaged. He hated that Vance had addressed her. He hated the confidence in her tone. He grabbed her elbow, his fingers digging into her arm. "If you'll excuse us," he growled, dragging her toward the dais. "My wife and I need to greet the guest of honor." "What the hell was that?" he hissed in her ear, his smile still pasted on his face for the crowd. "I was answering a question," Victoria said, her voice perfectly level. "You don't answer questions, Victoria. You smile. You let me do the talking, especially with that punk. You made me look weak, condescending to his nonsense." He asked my opinion. "Your opinion?" he whispered, his voice vibrating with rage. "Your opinion is whatever I tell you it is. You are a Sterling. You are my wife. Your only job tonight is to stand there, look beautiful, and not mess this up, do you understand?" Victoria looked at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were not timid. They were cold. They were the color of the ocean, just before a storm. She said nothing. She simply extracted her arm from his grip, smoothed the fabric of her gown, and locked the smile back onto her face. Alexander took her silence for submission. He was, as usual, catastrophically wrong. The main dining hall was a sea of black ties and glittering jewels. Alexander was radiating confidence at the head table, the coveted table 1, next to the podium. He had Arthur Kensington to his right and the mayor to his left. He was loud, charismatic, and utterly convinced of his imminent victory. The main course plates were cleared. The lights dimmed slightly. Amelia Jones, the columnist, materialized at their table, notepad in hand. This was highly unorthodox, but Amelia played by her own rules. "Alexander, one moment," she said, her voice low. The chatter at the table quieted. "The rumor is your Resurgence project is the frontrunner for the fund's first 9-figure grant under the new chair. Any comment?" "I can only say," Alexander said, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "that Sterling Holdings is profoundly committed to this city's future. We believe in building, not just talking." "But some," Amelia pressed, "say the project is entirely dependent on you being named chair, that it's a conflict of interest, that the fund would be supporting its own company." "That is slander, Amelia. The project stands on its own merits. It's the only one on the table big enough to truly matter." "And what about the opposition?" she asked. "Julian Vance's Green Connection proposal, for instance. It's smaller, more community-focused, and has a lot of popular support." Alexander let out a short, sharp laugh. "Vance? That's not a proposal. It's a pamphlet. It's a fantasy drawn on a napkin. You can't power a city with bike lanes and free Wi-Fi, Amelia. You need grit. You need steel." Then Amelia turned her pen and her attention to Victoria. It was the move of a masterful journalist, unbalancing the powerful man by addressing his silent partner. "Mrs. Sterling," Amelia said, her voice clear and precise. "You run the Kensington Trust. It's one of the oldest names in this room. Your trust focuses on community, on the arts, on the very popular efforts Mr. Vance seems to champion. What is your position on the Resurgence Project? Does the Kensington Trust endorse your husband's vision?" The table fell into absolute silence. Arthur Kensington swiveled his head, his old, intelligent eyes fixed on Victoria. Alexander saw this as an attack, a way to divide him. He saw Victoria in her pale gold dress as a liability. Before Victoria could articulate a single syllable, Alexander threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a loud, jarring "Goodbye." "Victoria," he thundered, splashing his wine. "You ask Victoria about a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project?" He patted her hand as if she were a child. "Darling, I don't think Amelia understands. Your trust is... What is it you do again? You fund poetry readings, don't you? And you saved that little community garden in the Lower East Side. Wonderful. Very sweet." Victoria's face was a porcelain mask. "Amelia," Alexander continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "My wife is a woman of immense taste. She can tell a Monet from a Manet at 20 paces. She can organize a gala for 500 people without breaking a sweat. Her committee decides the exact shade of beige for the napkins. It's a vital skill. But as for business," he continued, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial growl, "as for power, for the real work, that she leaves to me, as it should be." He smiled triumphantly. "Her only job," he said, raising his glass in a mocking toast toward her, "is to look beautiful and hold my glass. And she does it perfectly, doesn't she, darling?" The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Amelia Jones's pen was frozen. She looked horrified. Victoria Sterling remained perfectly motionless. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her stark white against the gold of her gown. Her gray eyes locked on Alexander. There was no anger in them, no sadness, only a deep Arctic cold, a finality. She did not cry. She did not yell. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her napkin on the table. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping lightly on the marble floor. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice a perfectly modulated whisper that nonetheless seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. She stood. She did not look at Amelia, nor the mayor, nor Arthur Kensington. She only looked at her husband. Then she turned and walked away from the table. She did not flee to the ladies' room. She walked calmly, with perfect posture, directly out of the main dining hall and into the lobby, disappearing from sight. Alexander watched her go, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Drama," he muttered to the table, forcing a laugh. "Probably upset over a broken nail. She'll be back. Now, Amelia, about that conflict of interest nonsense." But no one was listening. Everyone was staring at the empty chair where Victoria had been. Arthur Kensington slowly shifted his gaze from the door to Alexander. His expression was unreadable. Across the room, at his own table, Julian Vance had observed the entire exchange. He looked at the door where Victoria had vanished. Then he looked back at the oblivious, pontificating Alexander, and Julian Vance smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated anticipation. Alexander's good humor had been punctured. Victoria's exit was an embarrassment. It was a public display of dissent. He tried to recover, to steer the conversation back to his project, but the energy at the table had shifted. The smooth, steady confidence was gone, replaced by a strained courtesy. "She's sensitive," Alexander offered to the mayor, who was now meticulously studying his dessert fork. "The Kensingtons are all like that. Very temperamental. Artistic. Sure, the mayor murmured evasively. Alexander scowled. He mentally calculated the cost of this petulance. Another donation to her little trust. A new bracelet. It was infuriating. He was about to achieve the greatest triumph of his life, and she had to throw a fit over a harmless joke. It was, he thought, profoundly selfish. He glanced at his watch. 8:50 p.m. She'll be back, he muttered to himself. She knows she has to be here for the announcement. The lights dimmed further. The host returned to the podium. And now, the presenter's voice filled the room, it is my distinct honor to introduce a man who has been the custodian of our city's great legacy for 3 decades, a titan of industry, a patron of the arts, and a true New Yorker. Please welcome, for his final address as chair, the Honorable Arthur K. Kensington. The room erupted in a sustained, respectful standing ovation. Arthur, an 80-year-old man with a pin-straight back and clear blue eyes, walked slowly to the podium. He adjusted the microphone. Alexander straightened his Brioni jacket. This was his moment. Arthur tapped the microphone. The room fell silent. Thank you. Arthur's voice was frail, but it held immense authority. For 30 years, I have had the privilege of leading this great institution. The Metropolitan Legacy Fund is more than a collection of assets. It is the conscience of our city. He paused, looking at the sea of faces. When I took this office, he continued, the city was at a different time. We needed to be bold. We needed to build. We needed to show the world that New York was strong, permanent, and unyielding. We built with steel. Alexander smiled. He subtly nudged the mayor. But the world changes, Arthur said, his tone shifting. And the fund must change with it. The conscience of a city cannot be static. It must evolve. The challenges of the next 50 years are not the same. Brute force can build a tower, but it cannot build a future. Alexander's smile faltered. A cold knot began to form in his stomach. This was not the speech he had been led to expect. The board and I, Arthur said, have spent the last year in a silent, exhaustive search. We were not looking for another guardian. We were looking for a visionary. We were not looking for the loudest voice in the room. His eyes seemed to flicker for a microsecond toward Alexander. We were looking, Arthur said, for the smartest. We were looking for someone who understood that true, lasting power is not in the things we build for ourselves, but in the foundations we lay for others. We were looking for someone who didn't just understand legacy, but was the legacy. Alexander was no longer smiling. He was confused. This didn't sound like him. He glanced at Julian Vance's table. Vance was leaning forward, his expression intense. Is it Vance? The thought sent a jolt of panic through Alexander. The board vote was unanimous, Arthur Kensington declared. We have found a new chair, a new leader to move us all forward. For the last decade, she has been operating in plain sight, turning a near-bankrupt family trust into one of this state's most agile, powerful, and forward-thinking philanthropic engines. Alexander's blood ran cold. A family trust? This person, Arthur said, a rare, warm smile spreading across his face, has been on a dozen seemingly unimportant committees. This person has, without fanfare, saved libraries, funded minority startups, and anonymously endowed 3 distinct university chairs in sustainable urban development. This person has been building a new kind of legacy, one built not on noise, but on results. Alexander was drowning. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't possible. It was a joke, a horrible, elaborate joke. It is my deep honor, Arthur Kensington said, his voice rising, to pass the gavel of the Metropolitan Legacy Fund to its new chairwoman. Chairwoman. The entire room held its breath. Alexander Sterling's world, which had been so solid, so permanent, so made of steel, suddenly fractured. Please join me in welcoming the new chairwoman of the Metropolitan Legacy Fund, Ms. Victoria Alcaraz Sterling. For 3 full seconds, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. 3 seconds of absolute, stunned silence. Alexander Sterling did not move. He simply stared, his face a mask of complete, uncomprehending shock. He looked at the empty chair beside him, as if expecting Victoria to suddenly materialize, laughing at Arthur's strange joke. Then the applause began. It started at Julian Vance's table. He stood instantly, his applause loud, genuine, and thunderous. Amelia Jones, her notepad forgotten, also rose, her face an image of stunned, ecstatic revelation. Then the mayor rose. Then the senator. Within 10 seconds, the entire room was standing, a deafening wave of applause directed not at the stage, but at the main entrance to the hall. Alexander swiveled in his chair. A single, bright white spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand archway. And there she was. This was not the woman who had left the table. The pale, trembling, humiliated wife in the gold gown was gone. The woman under the spotlight was a queen. She wore a gown of deep, luminous emerald green, a custom-made Oscar de la Renta, cut with an architectural precision, severe and stunning. It had long sleeves, a high neck, and a bodice as structured as armor. Her pale skin and dark hair, now pulled into a severe, elegant chignon, were in sharp contrast. The Cartier diamonds were gone. In their place was one stunning, unique piece, the Kensington Parure, a waterfall of emeralds and diamonds not seen in public in 50 years. She did not wear a literal crown. She did not need one. She entered the room, not with the hesitant side glance of a socialite, but with the measured, unhurried stride of a predator who owns the territory. Her face was serene, her gray eyes scanning the room, acknowledging the applause with a slight, graceful nod. She did not look at table 1. She did not look at her husband. She walked directly to the stage, shook Arthur Kensington's hand, and accepted the light, symbolic gavel he offered. She turned to the audience, standing at the podium where Arthur had just spoken. The applause slowly subsided as people sat down, craning their necks, their minds reeling. Alexander was still standing, frozen next to his table. He looked like a statue, a monument to his own obsolete power. Victoria adjusted the microphone, gave a small tap, and waited. "Thank you, Arthur," she said. Her voice was not the whisper he was accustomed to. It was clear, crisp, and amplified, ringing with a musical authority that filled every corner of the vast hall. "Thank you to the board, and to all of you. For generations," she began, looking out at the room. "The Metropolitan Legacy Fund has been the bedrock of our city. It has been, as Arthur so rightly said, our strength, our steel. But the city is changing. The world is changing. And legacy is not a monument you build and abandon. It is a garden. It must be tended. It must be nurtured. And sometimes," her eyes swept the room, "it must be pruned." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. "The fund's mission must evolve," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We can no longer afford to fund monuments to the past. Or," she paused, "monuments to ego." Alexander Sterling physically recoiled. It was public murder. "Effective tonight," Victoria declared. "The MLF is pivoting. Our primary focus will no longer be on single-developer, large-scale projects. Our focus will be on sustainable community, digital equity, and green infrastructure. We will fund the connective tissue of our city, the libraries, the parks, the public data networks, the educational programs." She was dismantling Alexander's entire resurgence project piece by piece. She was declaring it, and him, obsolete in front of the very people he needed to impress. "The old way of doing things is over," she said. "The era of the vanity project is dead." Amelia Jones was writing so fast, her pen was a blur. The mayor nodded with a sudden political smile on his face, as if this had been his idea all along. "This is not just a promise," Victoria said. "It is a strategy, and it begins tonight. The MLF is proud to announce its first new initiative, the Green Connection Charter, a $500 million grant to revitalize and digitally integrate our community spaces." Alexander's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was trembling. "And," Victoria said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips, "to show that we are serious about a new way of collaboration. Combining the old legacy with a new vision, the MLF will not be funding this initiative alone. We are proud to announce our new lead partner in this venture." She looked directly at Julian Vance. "The Metropolitan Legacy Fund is officially partnering with the Vance Foundation." Vance stood, a wide, brilliant smile on his face. He bowed his head slightly toward Victoria. She nodded. It was a coronation, a new king and queen anointed. Alexander Sterling finally collapsed back into his chair. He had not merely been defeated, he had been annihilated. He was a ghost at his own funeral. Victoria's eyes finally moved to table 1. They passed the mayor, past the empty plates, and settled on her husband. She looked at the broken, white-faced, stammering man who an hour ago had told her to hold his glass. "True legacy," she said, her voice dropping, but her message clear, "is not about the name you build on a tower. It's about the one you build on a foundation. The MLF is now committed to building that foundation for all of New York. Thank you." The rest of the gala was a blur for Alexander. He was a non-entity. The people who had clapped him on the back an hour before were now giving him wide, pitying berths. He watched from a distance as a crowd formed around Victoria. Julian Vance was by her side. The mayor was laughing, his arm around her shoulder. Victoria was radiant. She was fluent without effort about bond issuances, zoning laws, and fiber optic partnerships. She was, Alexander realized with a nauseating pang, a genius. And she had hidden it. She had hidden all of it behind a mask of beige compliance for 10 years. He walked out of the gala, not even bothering to retrieve his coat. He stood on the grand steps of the Met. The cold night air, hitting his face like a slap, was all he felt. The drive back to Fifth Avenue was silent. He paced the vast marble living room, his tie ripped off, his jacket thrown onto the floor, when he heard the soft click of the private elevator. She entered. She still wore the emerald gown, the Kensington jewels resting on her collarbones. She looked, if possible, even more powerful in the sterile, modern environment of their home. She walked past him, heading to the bar. "You," he finally spat, his voice a hoarse, grating croak. You bitch!" Victoria stopped. She turned, not with fear, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. She poured herself a small glass of water. "You planned this?" he accused, his voice rising to a shout. "You humiliated me. You destroyed my project. You destroyed me." "Your project was an inflated, over-leveraged monument to your own ego, Alexander," she said, her voice as calm as the water in her glass. "It would have bankrupted the fund and displaced 5,000 people. It was a bad business deal. I killed a bad business deal." You're a housewife!" He roared the word, sounding ridiculous even to his own ears. You plan parties! You flowers!" "And napkins." Victoria took a small sip of water. "Yes, the napkins. While I was deciding the exact shade of beige, I was also listening. I was listening to the mayor complain about his budget shortfalls. I was listening to the hedge fund managers complain about your leverage. I was listening to the community leaders in Harlem, whom you never even met. You thought I was wallpaper, Alexander, and you were too arrogant to look closely at the pattern. The Kensington Trust. It's nothing, he screamed. It's petty cash. It was, she corrected. When you signed it over to me, it was worth about $4 million. This morning, the liquid assets of the Kensington Trust are valued at just over $1.2 billion. Alexander stopped. He couldn't process the number. $1.2 billion. How? You build with steel. I build with information. While you were making hostile takeovers, I was making silent, strategic seed investments. You like to buy companies. I like to fund founders. You'd be surprised what a $100,000 investment in a biotech firm 10 years ago is worth today. Or a small data processing company. One that, incidentally, Julian Vance's fund later acquired. He and I have been moving in the same circles for years, Alexander. You just never thought to ask who was in the room with me. You used me, he whispered, the rage turning into a cold, nauseating dread. You used me, she countered, her voice hardening for the first time. You married me for my name. You used me as an accessory. You silenced me, dismissed me, and belittled me. You thought I was an asset, and you were right. I was. Just not your asset. The dread in his stomach was now pure, unadulterated terror. He was finally seeing the chessboard. The MLF chairmanship, he stammered. Kensington, he didn't just— Arthur Kensington was my father's godfather, Victoria stated flatly. He has been my mentor since I was 20 years old. He asked me to take over the fund 3 years ago. I told him I wasn't ready. I told him I had one last piece of unfinished business. What business? Alexander whispered. Victoria walked to her antique desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. She slid it across the marble coffee table toward him. Sterling Holdings, she said. He opened it. His eyes scanned the pages. His face grew paler with every line. It was a breakdown of his company, his debt, his leveraged assets, and at the end, a list of his primary, secondary, and tertiary creditors. He looked up. What is this? Remember Phoenix Capital Group? She asked. The anonymous Asian fund that saved your Alcala Street deal 5 years ago? The one that bought up all your toxic debt and restructured it? He stared, bewildered. They saved me. That was me, Victoria said. Alexander's world wobbled on its axis. It was the Kensington Trust's first major acquisition, she explained. You were over-leveraged. You were about to lose everything. I couldn't allow that. I needed you to stay on top. I needed you to keep building, to keep borrowing, to keep expanding, to keep digging your own grave. I have been your primary creditor for 5 years, Alexander. He looked at her, mouth agape. No sound coming out. He was a fly in a web he had never seen. You don't just own me, he whispered. I own this apartment, she said. I own the car you ride in. I own the Sterling Resurgence Project, which I will officially dissolve tomorrow morning at the first MLF board meeting. I own you. She let that hang in the air. The final truth. Brutal and undeniable. Alexander Sterling, the man of granite and ambition, finally broke. He didn't just sit. He collapsed onto the cream-colored sofa. His body, moments before vibrant with rage, was now utterly slack. He buried his head in his hands, his elbows on his knees. The Brioni suit, his armor, felt cheap and heavy, like a costume. He was ruined. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the MLF chairmanship. It was the overwhelming, choking totality of his defeat. It was the realization that his entire life, his entire empire, had been a play directed by the one person he hadn't even considered an actor. He had been playing checkers against a grand master, and she had been playing for a decade. Why? He finally asked. His voice was not a roar. It was a dry, hollow croak that was swallowed by the cavernous room. Why? All this? 10 years, Victoria. Why not just leave me? Victoria stood by the window, her back to him, looking out at the glittering expanse of Central Park. The emerald of her dress seemed to absorb the city lights. "Leave you, Alexander?" she said, her voice quiet and thoughtful. That would have been incomplete. That would have been an emotional act. This was never about emotion. This was about restoration. She turned. Her face was not filled with hatred, or even triumph. It was the dispassionate, objective face of a CEO who had just successfully completed a hostile acquisition. "You were destroying my family's name," she stated simply. "You didn't just marry me, you consumed my legacy. You took the Kensington name, a name that meant something in this city, and you turned it into a joke, a footnote in the social pages. The quiet, pretty, stupid wife of Alexander Sterling." She began to walk slowly toward him, her heels clicking with the finality of a marble floor. "My grandfather, Robert Kensington, endowed the City University's School of Engineering. My mother, Carmen Kensington, funded the first free women's clinic in this city. They built foundations. They built futures." She stopped, standing over him. "And you?" she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of profound contempt. "Had their descendant? Me? Reduced to a photograph in Vogue, complimented on my impeccable taste in napkins." The word hung in the air, vibrating with a decade of suppressed fury. "I didn't do this for revenge, Alexander. Revenge is a messy, passionate thing. This," she said, gesturing to the room, to the city, toward him, "was a correction. I was restoring the Kensington legacy, and to do that, I had to completely and surgically dismantle the Sterling one." He looked up from his hands, his face ashen. The full, horrifying scope of his arrogance was finally crashing down on him. "You were so desperate to prove you were the smartest man in the room," she said. "You never stopped to think about who else was in it. Your contempt for me was the most valuable asset I had. It was the perfect cover. Tonight," he stammered, the memory of his own voice, his own public mockery hitting him like a physical blow. "At the table, when I said those things you already knew. I let you be you, Alexander," she said. "That was all that was required." "And now what?" he asked, his voice the plea of a broken man. "What happens? You liquidate me? Throw me out on the street?" "Don't be dramatic," she said, her voice devoid of pity. "This isn't a soap opera. This is a transaction." She walked to the massive glass coffee table. From her small emerald clutch, she pulled a key and unlocked a drawer in the antique Kensington desk. She brought out 2 leather-bound portfolios. "At 9 a.m. tomorrow morning," she said, placing the first one in front of him. "Sterling Holdings and all its subsidiaries will be officially absorbed into a new urban development arm of the Kensington Trust, an arm I will chair in conjunction with my MLF duties." He stared at the cover, his own logo, but did not open it. "The Sterling name will cease to exist in the market," she continued, as if reading a financial report. "The Resurgence project is dead, as I said. Your services are no longer required." That phrase, the cold corporate dismissal, hit him harder than any shout. He had been fired from his own life. "But I am," he stammered, gesturing futilely between them. "I am your husband." "You are not," she said, placing the thinner, blue-backed second document on top of the first. "Divorce papers." He stared at them. "Sterling v. Sterling." It was the final, clean, surgical cut. "My attorney, Mr. Hidalgo, is waiting in the lobby," she said. "He will come up in 5 minutes to collect your signature. I have already signed." Alexander let out a sound, a rough, choked laugh. "You expect me to fight this? With what grounds? With what money?" "Exactly," she said. "You are not in a position to. The terms are clean. I am not a cruel woman, Alexander. only thorough. You will be left with a small stipendiary trust. It has already been funded. She paused. Enough to maintain your club membership and live comfortably. But you will never build or borrow or matter in this city again. You will be, in effect, an amateur. The reference to his own insult was so precise, so devastating, it took his breath away. You have been my tenant. She pointed to the great entrance. Beside the door, a single, modest black suitcase sat alone. Your personal effects have been packed. You will stay at the club. Temporarily, of course. Where you go after that is your concern. A lifetime, an empire, reduced to one piece of carry-on luggage. He took the heavy, expensive pen from the table. His hand trembled, but he opened the file. He found the signature line. The sound of the tip scratching the thick linen paper was deafening. The death of his world signed in triplicate. He slid the document back across the table. Did you think of everything? He muttered. It wasn't a question. She said. I did. She turned and walked to the private elevator. She had taken off the heavy Kensington necklace and was rubbing the skin of her collarbones. A small, tired, human gesture. The armor was coming off. The job was done. She pressed the call button. Victoria, he said, his voice raw. She stopped, her hand on the opening elevator door, but she did not turn around. That joke I made tonight, he stammered, the shame finally burning in his throat. At the table, about you holding my glass. I remember, she said, her voice quiet. It was the truth, Alexander. He looked up, confused. It was the only true thing you said all night. You just misidentified the roles. She stepped into the mirrored elevator and turned to look at him one last time. The woman he never saw, in the emerald gown. Her gray eyes as clear and cold as winter. You see, she said, as the heavy brass doors began to close. You were never the king. You were just the man holding my glass while I bought the bar. The doors closed with a soft, final sigh, sealing him in. He was left alone in the vast, empty penthouse, with nothing but a suitcase and the resounding silence of his own magnificent, catastrophic failure. In the end, Alexander Sterling signed the papers. He vanished from the world of power, a ghost haunting the clubs he used to own. Amelia Jones's article about the Gala coup became the most read in the country's history. A modern legend of power, arrogance, and the quiet, invisible genius of Victoria Alcaraz Sterling. She kept the name for the trust, not the man. Victoria, of course, thrived as the chairwoman of the MLF and head of the Kensington Trust. She and Julian Vance fundamentally remade the city, focusing on the very communities Alexander had scorned. She was never caught hunting again. She didn't need to be. She was too busy building her own legacy, one of steel, yes, but of a stronger steel. The kind forged in silence, patience, and an absolutely unshakable purpose. What did you think of Victoria's decade-long plan? Was it brilliant, or was it cold-blooded? Leave us your comments below.